Good evening and welcome to the podcast, Rethinking Faith. We are the podcast where we take a good look at the historical context of Scripture and that of Jesus as well. I am Mitch Moyer. I'm one of your hosts. I'm joined tonight by James Ballard up in beautiful Baltimore. James, how you doing, buddy?
Good, Mitch. Hey, everyone. How are you doing?
Hey, doing great, man. Got some pretty good news. James is about to make a trek with his family and move down south here from Baltimore to the Atlanta town. And you guys excited about making this trip?
Yeah, it's funny. When we mentioned this a few months ago, it seemed like it was a lifetime away, but here we are. We're within a couple of days.
Yeah.
We're excited about it. Atlanta. We hear a lot of good things. It's really the first move for our whole family. So yeah, it's a whole lot of firsts. We're looking forward to it.
Well, we are excited about having you down here in the ATL and just North Atlanta is a beautiful part of the city and a lot going on up that way. So having you closer is going to be really cool. If we could just at one point get Ray up here from Miami and the three of us could get together and have a big dinner and then just sit up all night long and just talk about something important. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, record some live episodes.
A live episode, man. Yes. Excuse me. But I want to apologize ahead of time. My sinuses are kind of messing with me a little bit. We're having some pretty good thunderstorms down here in Atlanta this evening, so we're doing our best to try to get this episode recorded. This is episode 10 in season 2, and this is a 2-part series, by the way. We're excited about. James and I and Ray have been working on this particular episode that we've split up. James and I are going to hit the first half of it tonight, and then I believe Ray and I are going to try to hit the next half of it next week. So, and the title of this particular episode is The Birth of the Church. And that's a very, very interesting. When we talk about the word church, a lot of times you'll hear within the church a specific, you have a specific feel, a specific way that you think about church. And then whenever you hear the history of the church talked about, generally, James, you correct me if I'm wrong here, it usually goes back to a certain point in time. A lot of times with the church fathers or back to a certain point where a denomination feels that it ought to go to in order to support their specific viewpoint or their lens. But what we're going to do is we're all about the history. We're all about historical context. We're all about taking it all the way back. So we're going to move a little bit further back in time. We're going to go back to the days of Jesus, and we're going to go back prior to that. We're going to take a look at how this whole concept of that word came about. We're going to look at how did the church emerge? You know, what brought it about to get from what it originally was and meant to be to what it is today.
Yep.
What was Jesus the first Christian? We're going to take a look at, a lot of people feel that Jesus created this new religion, and it was his purpose to push this religion out. And so with that, we're going to take a look at, did Jesus really create, was he the first Christian, which would entail that Christianity was around, at that time. Was Paul the first Christian? Paul came after Jesus. What did his letters these private letters that he sent out to these gatherings, were these letters meant to create these additional gatherings of Gentiles to look and feel differently than the gatherings that were originally together, prior to that? And when was Paul converted to Christianity? It's an interesting question. Most believers feel that he was converted to Christianity, and we're going to take a hard look at what that really means and if that was so and what that might look like. And so before we get started delving into, I let you pull out that bucket of knowledge that you have there, buddy, and start cranking this out a little bit. I've got a little statement here from a gentleman by the name of Daniel Lancaster. And Daniel is one of the main contributors and writers for a organization called FFOZ, or First Fruits of Zion. And he writes for a some material called the Torah Club. It's some fantastic learning material about contextual pieces of scripture as well as that of Jesus himself. But he says a quote here. He says, if Christianity had not, well, actually, I'm sorry, let me back that up. He starts with a statement that says, talking about replacement theology and its outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've been around history, or you studied the history of theology within the church environment, you would have probably have heard or come across this word replacement theology. And that's simply that's an easy term to describe, where certain people believe that God's chosen the original folks that God created his covenant with and all that. He just cut them off, went away, and then said, I'm going to replace them with the church. And we have talked about this, and that is absolutely incorrect. It is wrong theology. It leads to misconceptions, misunderstandings, and really a lot of pain for a lot of people. So talking about replacement theology and its outcome, Daniel says this: if Christianity had not been hijacked by anti-Semitism and anti-Torah theology 1900 years ago, every Christian Bible reader would understand the obscurity of this proposition. A Messiah who breaks the Sabbath and advocates breaking the Sabbath is no Messiah at all. God himself commands the Jewish people to reject such a Messiah. And what's interesting about that quote for me, James, is understanding the word Messiah, where it comes from. You know, how we label Jesus as a Messiah. If he correctly accepts that title and that label, then there's certain parameters that come with that. And in order to fit that bill, so to speak, or that job description, he would not advocate or break the Sabbath. And we talked about that in a specific episode. But I thought that was an interesting comment by Daniel, and I'd like a little bit of input from you on that comment. And then I'm going to let you just go ahead and get started with the actual moving into the historical piece of this, and then we'll just banter with it back and forth a little bit. So I'm going to turn it over to you, buddy.
Yeah, it's a really, really powerful quote. And so it kind of steers us in the direction. It frames where we're going with this historical lesson. And like you said, some people, they think of the church history, they don't go much further past, if they're Protestant, usually they don't go much further than Martin Luther. If they're Catholic, or if they're in the Eastern tradition of the church, they may go a little bit further back. But I think in order to really, truly understand what this movement was about, you have to go back to the Jewish world. And we spend a considerable amount of time on this show unpacking that. So I always encourage people, go back and listen to our other shows. We have one about anti-Semitism in the church, and we have another one about the Pharisees. So you can really come at this from two different perspectives. But tonight, we're going to go back and take a look at the early decisions. And I would say some of these are present in the New Testament already, but from the time of about, we'll say, the 2nd century onward to about 300. And like you said, Ray will fill us in on the Jewish track of this movement, but we're going to look at mostly the European, because I think this is what largely affected the rest of the world, Christendom, if you will, Christianity. And it really comes from within the Roman Empire. And that's important to know, because as we will unpack, that really has a lot of implications. If you believe that Jesus was the first Christian or Paul was the first Christian, then all of your beliefs cascade from whatever that means to you in your tradition. But if you truly understand or believe that Yeshua was a Jew and Paul was Jewish and the apostles were Jewish, then you're already in new territory for many people. So
yes.
So I want to start off first with what's in the New Testament. Let's just talk about what's there. All of Paul's letters, and we've said this in the past, are are a form of responsa. So there's a problem in a Jewish community, and it's well known that a rabbi will write a responsa or an epistle to the leaders of that community to help them navigate that problem. And the letter he writes to one is not necessarily the letter he would write to another.
Right.
Usually they have their own context. And that's
Right.
typical of rabbinic responsa in these epistles. And you can see writers like, like Maimonides, he has an epistle. I'm thinking of a few epistles that sound a lot like Paul's, but I want to focus on a few of them, right? So we saw already Paul was being misunderstood. There is this belief that we read about in Acts 21. He gets to Jerusalem and James says, hey, there are a lot of Judeans here and a lot of them believe. And look how zealous they are for the law, right? And I'm going to read Acts 21, verse 21. And they've been told that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. And this is a heavy charge, right? If Paul is doing this, then he is absolutely going against the Torah in a big way. We should pretty much remove all of his books from the New Testament because that's a huge violation. So then James comes up with a remedy for this because apparently he doesn't believe this to be true. He says this is a rumor. So in verse 23, he says, therefore do what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them. Pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, and that you yourself live in observance of the law. Now, he's talking about taking them into the temple. And if you're a Gentile, if you're not of the Jewish people, you can't go into the temple. You can't escort these people going for their vow. You can't follow them in. So James seems to believe enough that he is a Torah obedient Jew, and he instructs him to do a very pro-Torah, pro-temple thing. And I think too many people dismiss that. They might wave it off. But if James doesn't see him as a Torah obedient Jew, he wouldn't do this, or he would be very deceitful for trying to create some kind of illusion that Paul is still part of this religion, if you will. But I would even go further to say that there was no Christianity at this time. There wouldn't be for quite a while. Not at this time. So what I think a lot of this breaks down to, Paul's letters are dealing with Gentile issues for the most part. He's dealing with all of these congregations, some of which he created or helped create, or some he didn't. He hadn't even been to some of them. Romans is one of them. And we're seeing this disunity taking place, often between Greeks and Jews in the synagogue community. You get a glimpse of this ongoing problem in Rome already. You're already seeing that some of the Roman citizens are not falling under the obedience of the Jewish authority, and they're becoming somewhat of separatists, right? So Romans really kind of bounces back and forth in knocking both groups down, but it does have a very powerful chapter or two where, especially Romans 11, where Paul reminds this Roman audience, because apparently they needed to be reminded at this time that they are the wild branches grafted into the root, which is Israel, not the other way around.
Yes.
Right. So we see this in chapters 10, 11, and 12. Paul is reminding, and thank Hashem he did that, because we have these verses today to look at. Paul is trying to teach this rapidly increasing Gentile influx, these people, this influx of believers who want to be a part of this Jewish movement. He's trying to teach them their place in this under the Jewish leadership. And we see this, we see problems. We see this isn't going very well. Galatians, I'm of the belief that Galatians was one of the earliest letters written, because the Jerusalem Council seems to solve the problem that the Galatians questions are circling around. Should Gentiles be converted to Jews? And that has an eschatological component to it. It's the sign of the kingdom in some people's eschatological outlook. And I think they made a beautiful decision in the Jerusalem Council in somewhere between 40 and 50 CE, Acts 15 records it, that the Gentiles can be included in the community if they assumed they're taking on the Noahide Laws already, if they take on these 4 extra commandments. And what's going on is the Gentiles are already taking part in the community and observing the Noahide laws. And we've spoken about this as well. We should probably do an episode of Acts 15 on its own. But they're keeping the Noahide laws, right? The laws of Noah set out by Hillel in the century before. But the apostles actually give them a few extra things, which are kind of coming from the precedent set by the stranger in the land, the Ger Toshav. And the Ger Toshav is the Gentile who is residing in Israel. They have a little bit more laws upon them than the Noahide laws because you want to be careful not to contaminate the Jewish community or the land of Israel or Jerusalem. So it's a beautiful ruling.
James, let me just ask you a quick question for those that this might be the first episode they're picking up on, but can you just unfold just briefly Noahide laws? Because when we say this, I've been studying this for a little while, as you have, and kind of understand what we're getting at here. But for those that are just tuning in, maybe for the first time, because of the title of this episode, can you just explain just a little bit what the Noahide laws are, and what is this that you're alluding to with this within this piece that you're talking about right here, man?
Good question. Good question. Yeah. So the Noahide laws are captured in a few places. One is in the Talmud, another is in the Tosefta, which is a compilation that comes a little bit before the Talmud. And the Noahide laws are basically this. So Rabbi Hillel, in the century before Yeshua, came to the understanding that all humans in the world are supposed to be under these 7 laws. And they got to these by counting all the commandments given to Adam and Eve all the way up to the time of Moses. And they came up to these 7, and they look like this. So in the Tosefta, they are described as the laws concerning dinim, which is adjudication, like laws, governance. The second one is concerning idolatry, right? Avoiding idolatry. 3, avoiding blasphemy. 4, all things concerning sexual immorality, you avoid. 5, concerning bloodshed, murder, right? 6, concerning robbery, gezel. And 7, concerning eating an animal or the limb torn from an animal. We might call that treifa. So they understood that anyone who among the Gentiles kept these 7 laws, they were allowed to take part in the synagogue community. If they didn't, they weren't allowed to. There's a whole reason that we'll probably have to cover this in a show at some point for sure. Now, of course, the Jewish people are given the 10 commandments, and of course, the 10 commandments can be expanded into 613 laws, right? But the Noahide are actually, it's a quite complex set of instructions for Gentiles to follow who are coming out of the Roman Empire.
Yes.
And this will create tension, and we'll talk about this later, but it's not enough to say that the apostles expected them to keep the Noahide laws. They actually added 4 more categories on top of that. Drinking blood, eating things, right, that are strangled and sacrificed to idols, and then sexual immorality, because these were all things that were very prevalent in the Roman Empire. So the Noahide laws are the base commandments for all humans across the world. And of course, these are some of the laws that Sodom and Gomorrah were punished for violating. Yeah. But the apostles in Acts 15 make it clear that we expect you to be above the average human on earth. We want you to represent a higher level of adherence to the Torah. Right? So we see this in Acts 15. It's beautiful. And it says, in the synagogue community, because they will learn Moses and the law every Shabbat in the synagogue. So it's very clear that the apostles are expecting a lot of these Gentiles. So this was a very difficult transition for some, I'm sure, as we see all of the epistles of Paul he's reiterating in some sense. And, 1st, 2nd Peter as well, you can see that he's really kind of hammering home the idea that they're not keeping up to the bare minimum. You see those pronouns of us and you, and yes. Right. You see the pronouns there. So he's speaking to the Gentiles in 1st and 2nd Peter. But all that to say, in my reading, the epistles are examples of all the problems already in the water in these congregations. Because remember, it's a very strict time in the Jewish world. The Gentiles are not really supposed to be interacting with your pious Jews according to the ruling of Shammai. So and of course we did this in our Pharisees episode, Rabbi Shammai, the house of Shammai. So under that context, Paul is doing something very, very challenging. He's trying to bring a lot of pagans, to be quite honest, into this community and convert them from a pagan lifestyle to those among Israel in varying degrees, right? Some clearly got it. Cornelius is one who got it. There are many women in the New Testament who got it, but there were some who evidently didn't get it, and there were real problems. So all that to say, we already see some problems in Paul's letters that some people aren't getting it, and it's causing friction in the community, and people aren't getting along. And Paul's doing his best to try to navigate this. So, that's the high level. In your experience, how have you heard the Noahide Laws presented? Have you ever heard Acts 15 taught?
No, sir. Not in the terms of, because within the church, there's not really, I've never had an experience where that needed to be brought out in a teaching. Most teachings and most environments today are very they're built around practical pieces. How do I how do I manage my money better? How do I manage my family better? How do I keep myself from thinking certain thoughts? So those bullet points there a lot of times lead to specific teachings of Paul's that you like, Ephesians, Galatians, First, Second Timothy, James is another one, and so that's what you get. That's your bread and butter for most of the time when you're outside of, whether it's Easter or going into Christmas or something like that, where you have specific themes that you're working on. But never did I, in my experience within the church, ever hear anything about the Noahide laws, and yet the way, not just the way you describe them, but the way they are within Scripture itself, the understanding that those were put out there for, because even if you skip that for just a moment and you just talk about the discussion of the laws themselves, is such a negative piece within the church, period. And so that's kind of always pushed to the shelf, and a lot of big blowing and going churches, from what I call them blowing and going churches that are just emotionally driven. You're never going to get into that element. You're never going to get that deep into that element. It's always going to be get you risen up to a certain element, to a certain level of feeling or participation, or so forth like that. And I'd never heard it brought up in church before, period. So I don't have anything I can add to that, until I started studying back through the context and understanding what was meant by these laws and who they were for.
Yeah. And it's a shame, because it's evident in the mind of the Jewish worldview that we're studying in the New Testament. Spiritual development comes from obedience to these laws. Physical impurity dampens spiritual growth. So all of these very seemingly physical stipulations, if you will, are actually the crux of the problem we're seeing with these people who aren't, they're falling away. Their faith is not strong because they're spiritually disconnecting themselves by not abiding by these. And this, in my opinion, is how a pastor can have thousands of people and growing and growing and growing and completely fall apart and be disconnected. And unfortunately, because spiritual growth is governed and given in the Torah, and the Noahide laws are the ones most people, even Christians, never mind Acts 15, these laws are expected upon people. Now, when you add Acts 15, you're talking, this is a lot. This is very difficult. Just the category of sexual immorality alone is very broad. What does that look like in our time and place today? So let me do this. Let me give a quick run up of the history. We'll do like we'll put the rubber on the road here, and we will look at the history that leads to problems. So right after the Apostolic era, we see an immediate series of events that really starts to rip the Jewish people and the Gentile believers apart. And it's not that all Jews didn't believe in Jesus and Christianity was created. That's not true at all. And we'll see that. What we're seeing is they go along relatively in unison until a certain point, and then it just comes off the rails, and here we go. So after the times of the New Testament, and even in the New Testament, we see key Jewish leadership are executed, right? So we see James, the brother of John's, executed in 44 CE. Peter and Paul are killed by Nero, and it looks like they're both killed in the same year, 67. James, also the brother of Yeshua, executed around the time of 67. And that's recorded in Josephus, and it seems as if he was a Torah obedient Jew all the way to the end. Clement, Peter's disciple, if you will, he was executed. He was actually a Gentile who was converted. It seems as if he was converted from the time after the New Testament by Peter himself. But he's killed in 95, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then John, who lived the longest, he dies somewhere in the era of Trajan from 98 CE to 117. So we see instantly within 100 years, all of the key leadership, the people who either knew Yeshua directly or were directly connected to one of his students, we see these people starting to die by the mid 100s. Another big problem, right? So there you go. Your leadership is waning. Now you no longer have the people who were there anymore to keep a lid on this growing, what's going to be a problem, this growing diversity of thought around these topics. Then many times the Jews are expelled from Rome, sometimes for just simply not abandoning their faith. They're not taking part in the Roman religion, and you're out of here. And that happens in 19 CE under Tiberius, 50 CE under Claudius. We see probably one around, I think that one's actually in the New Testament. It seems as if there's a problem, what we're going to talk about in a little bit, of Gentiles being they're being enticed into the Jewish world, and that's a big problem for Rome, and we'll unpack that. But the biggest one comes in 135 after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and that's the time of Emperor Hadrian. And unfortunately, at this time, every time these expulsions happen in Rome and in Jerusalem and Israel, the Gentile community is left alone. They don't have the Jewish leadership anymore. Those Jews are out. We're seeing a few things lead up to this already in 3rd John. John's indicating that his apostolic leadership is being rejected. He mentions in 3rd John 9 that somebody rejects his authority. Now the audacity of someone to come in who, right, like he's rejecting, the beloved disciple, if you will, like probably one of the most knowledgeable of definitely the longest living. Eusebius tells us, as a church historian, I'm not a huge fan of his perception of the Jewish people, but he can be useful in historical matters in some places. He tells us that the deceit of false teachers replaced the leaders when the apostles left. So Clement writes to the Corinthians, and many people aren't aware of this, but he basically doesn't have the authority to write to the Corinthians, but he writes to them to tell them that they're completely wrong in the way they're living. And apparently they also had rejected their, how would you say this, their apostolically placed leadership. So we see in a very short period of time, these communities are falling apart. And unfortunately, you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, it could be viewed as beautiful writing. Unfortunately, that community goes through a lot of trouble and ultimately is catastrophically flawed. Probably one of the biggest problems, and again, sourcing it starting in the New Testament, Peter mentions that Paul's words are being twisted, and Paul's very difficult to understand, right? So maybe that has something to do with what James has warned him of, that there's a rumor, right? That you're teaching the Jews. He's not saying anything about Gentiles. He's saying you're teaching the Jews to abandon the Torah. Well, Peter tells us that Paul's words are easy to twist in that sense. And we start to see in the later generations a schism developing between Judean influence and Pauline influence. So the next generation of people, you have your Judeans, your pro-Torah Jews. Ray will talk about this in the next episode because it's critical to understand this. There's still Jewish diversity, but the Torah is upheld. But now we're seeing this Pauline, second generation, third generation Pauline understanding, and it's being twisted, as Peter says, it's being twisted to a form of lawlessness. And a lot of the Clement homilies, Clement, his disciples are of the Judean understanding. And there are some other epistles, the Epistle of Peter to James. And you're seeing this movement is still relatively inside the Jewish world. We're not quite out of that yet. That's going to come later. But we're seeing it's a battle of, or to what level of Torah are we upholding? And in this struggle, communities are falling apart. We're watching, again, through all of the things we mentioned, the exiles and some of the things we'll unpack, the leaders being killed or rejected. We're seeing these communities fall apart. And that's around the time you see the Didache appear on the scene as a way of telling the Gentile community, hey, we're not going to be around here. So here is very forward thinking of the person, whoever wrote this, to write this kind of instruction manual, because it looked as if the Jewish leadership were phasing out at this point.
Right.
And all of this is after the apostolic era. So that's where we are now. We're around the time of, we'll say 70 to like 120.
Okay. And let you get a breath of air here there for just a second. When you mentioned the Didache, which is a fascinating manual and, like you said, instruction manual on those Gentiles or those outside that are wanting to participate, there is actually a really good copy that was produced by First Fruits of Zion that was put together. And they put it out. I have a copy of it. You can get it through their website, but it's fantastic to read because, like you said, it was written as an instruction manual for those that were wanting to participate, with God's people and learning how to navigate that, because that was crucial. Where instead of having this split down, this just you're either on the left or you're on the right, you had this opportunity to begin to meld it, work yourself over this way with this instruction manual and to read it in today's culture and today's society and in language that we can understand today. It's a fascinating read, and it's a fascinating book to keep around, just to keep yourself understanding what that concept really looks like. So if you're familiar with the First Fruits of Zion website and their store there, you can pick up a copy of the Didache, and I would recommend it highly.
Yeah, it's a book, The Way of Life by Toby Janicki.
Yes.
A good one.
Yes.
And you mentioned something really interesting. I'm sure some people will balk at the idea of us saying that there is no church yet. The idea of church and Christianity. So the word Christian it's another way of saying like messianics, right? We're basically saying like messianics.
Mhm.
So we're still within a Jewish context here. Of course, Messiah is a Jewish concept, and it's very thematic throughout the New Testament and rabbinic writings. But the word for church, and this is a study on its own, I just want to touch on it briefly. It's being taken from the Greek word ecclesia.
Mhm.
And ecclesia was actually translated from the Hebrew kahal into the Septuagint as ecclesia. So it can't mean church if it happened before Yeshua, right? We're talking about the Septuagint. So kahal is really just another word for assembly. And an assembly is talking about a body of people. And often in the Hebrew, it's a, generally speaking, a body of Jewish people. Ecclesia is used very consistently as well to mean a body of people. And often the building references, there are a house of gathering, right? But what we're seeing is the word in Greek synagogue.
Yes.
And that's very clear to me what that's talking about. So we don't have a church yet, technically speaking. That's anachronistic to think church and to think Christianity at this point. That will come in a couple centuries from where we are now. but not yet. We're not seeing that yet, even though the New Testament is translated as such.
Yes.
That's not technically or historically accurate.
Good point. Good point, man.
Yeah. So let me do this. Let me jump from. Let me touch on a few key things that happened, and we'll jump back into this. So everyone knows that the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It's a very fascinating story, and we should cover it from a Jewish perspective as well, because it's critical to know how Judaism today is of the same mindset of what Yeshua taught, but that's for another story. So we see after 70 AD, we see the Jewish people, they retreat to a place called Yavne, and Ray will talk more about this. But Emperor Vespasian, he creates a new discriminatory tax. And this would never fly today, right? None of this stuff would fly today in our culture. But he creates a tax basically for all Jews throughout the empire. You're going to pay for that rebellion, right? And it's a very heavy tax, and these are already a poor and oppressed people. And this tax was formerly a tax to keep up the temple. Now, to add insult to injury, this money is going to be used for the temple, but the temple is now dedicated to Jupiter. So it's against the Torah for a Jew to give money for idol worship. So here they are, they're being asked and told, right, voluntold to pay for the rebellion. Oh, and by the way, you're going to give that money to the god of Jupiter because our God defeated your God. Right?
Yeah.
So now this is the worst part. It wasn't just the working age, healthy Jews who were responsible, as it might have been in the earlier form of the tax. This is a tax on women, children, elderly, slaves, etc. If you were Jewish, you were paying this tax, or you were accountable for this tax. So somebody was paying this tax for you. But needless to say, many Jews weren't paying it. They either couldn't, or those who were pious, ultra pious, they found it a violation of the Torah, taking part in idolatry. And furthermore, it's humiliating, right? It's here as a people group who are already marginalized to a large extent. Their temple's been destroyed, their way of life has been overturned, upended, and now they're being made to pay for it and contribute to idolatry. So this is interesting because the son of Vespasian, Domitian, he comes in right after his father and he reigns, and he expands this tax to all converts to Judaism. And this could be people who, they weren't natural born Jews, but now if you want to convert to that religion, it's going to cost you.
Yeah.
Right. So you're now going to enter a new category. It's going to cost you a lot of money. Probably a way to stop the missionary activity that's going on. And this became a problem for the early Messianic community, because now you have Gentiles who are living among the Jewish people. That's their community, right? So try to get in the mind of what it might have been like for them. And Domitian takes inventory of, why aren't we making as much money as we should be making? What's going on here? And they find that there is a significant amount of Gentile people who are believers in this Yeshua guy who sounds like that's a threat to the emperor, right? You have a king. Well, you already have a king. You have an emperor, right? What are you talking about, this other guy? But they're also living like Jews. They lived like Jews, as Domitian describes them, and they're not paying the taxes as the Jews did. But they're still Roman citizens, but they're living like Jews. And for us to really get in the mindset of this is a big deal. This puts the empire at risk, right? That you could make the gods angry. They worked on a quid pro quo status, apparently. You had to appease the gods so you could win wars, appease the gods more so people they don't challenge your borders, or however this goes. That's the way their gods worked. So if you have a significant amount of people, quote unquote, worshiping this other king and throwing money into that cause and not the empire, you have a big problem. So Domitian, in short, starts to find ways of getting the Jewish communities to produce a list of Gentiles who are among their communities. And that's a really bad thing for a community, because Jews being expelled often, this seems as if it's part of why Domitian there was another expulsion around this time, and it seems as if it was because of these issues. There were too many Gentiles being pulled into the way of Israel. And one of them was Clement, actually Clement, I mentioned him earlier, Peter's disciple. He was a cousin of Domitian, and he was converted to Judaism, like we said, and he was executed for that in 95. So we're seeing it's a big problem. It's not only is it a slap in the face to the empire and the emperor, it's actually a financial problem. So
Yes.
Domitian had to really figure out how to get the community to turn on itself in order to weed out these people who were kind of living in that no man's land and not
Yes.
paying the money. So it's a big problem. And, you know, I mean, we look at this, the Jewish presence fading many times, or people being kicked out of the synagogue because they're causing trouble or they're not, you know, it's survival on the synagogue's part. You can see the tension start to rise, and the tension between the Jews and the non-Jews really starts to mount. And then in the time of Nerva, you start to see now there's a distinction being made. Now the empire is able to better distinguish between Jews and non-Jews who are in these congregations, and the persecutions start to come heavy and rapidly. And now the Gentiles who are part of this movement are also being targeted because they're countercultural, the Roman Empire. And you know, even the greatest thinkers of Roman philosophy and writers like Seneca, Persius, Petronius, and Juvenal, and Plutarch, and Tacitus. I mean, we've quoted Tacitus before, and Appian. They all had slanderous and hateful things to say against the Jewish people and anyone who was drifting into their lifestyle. And they saw it as I believe it's Tacitus who says it's in every way against the Roman Empire's values. So keep in mind, let's just do like a quick inventory, and then I want to get your thoughts on this. We see expulsions.
Mhm.
We see waning Jewish leadership. We see the original leaders dying, and we're just about at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s, right? So we're seeing the empire is now trying to squeeze out the Gentiles who are part of these communities, and meanwhile the Jews are, you know, particularly persecuted in an ongoing way. And then you start to have pop culture, Roman pop culture, the greatest thinkers adding their 2 cents into the mix about how the Jews are evil and hateful. So it's not hard to see that the tides are turning from what was already a problem in Paul's letter in Romans. The tides are turning heavily against the Jewish people and then against the people who are attached to them. So the situation is terrible in Rome, and that's before we get to the Bar Kokhba revolt, which we'll briefly touch on. But what do you think of that?
Well, you know, it's hard to really living in a culture and a world like we do today, a political system, the culture of our country that we live in. It's very difficult to understand the concept of just suppressing a people group like what's going on here and hitting them in certain ways economically, hitting them, expulsing, getting them out of areas like that. It's it's the only thing I can even begin to process is thinking back to the Second War, thinking back to the way the Jews were treated, what happened there. But even that just doesn't really add up to the kind of what you see that goes on here, and the circles that are having to be made in order to survive and to continue this belief system, this faith, this people group, and what's being done to them is there's nothing today that can compare to it. There's nothing I know of that in my years of living that I can that I could put my finger on that would really give a clear picture of it or give a clear analogy of what's going on here, and for them to still maintain the thought, the practice, the participation, the involvement of this faith, and not let it just completely die out. And it's a tough one to try to, from an analytical standpoint, but also from a practical standpoint. It's just, you're on both sides of the spectrum when it comes to it. And it fascinates me when you like I alluded to it earlier, is the church puts a big emphasis on anti-racism and anti-bigotry and things like this, but yet when you look at the founding church fathers that developed the theology that they work with, are some of the biggest anti-Semitic, we're talking just pure nasty when you get into people like Luther, and you get into people, that just, I mean, when you read some of the writings and read some of the statements that were made about the Jews, and just to do all that they could do to separate, the the context, the culture, and who Jesus really was, it's amazing. You walk into a building and they want to be inclusive of everyone, except they're some of the largest and some of the strongest groups out there when it comes to anti-Semitism. And that is extremely dangerous when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to his teachings, when it comes to who he was, as a person, the culture, what builds the foundation of Scripture and builds the foundation of the New Testament. It's fascinating when you finally realize that, James, and you finally realize just how deadly that is, and how it's masked and covered up and talked around. And I think exposing it a little bit is extremely important, because you do have a lot of pastors out there that are very passionate about leaving that behind.
Yeah.
And as one pastor once put, not too long ago, disconnecting yourself from the Old Testament and living out just the New Testament in order to be a successful Christian, which, when you break that down, makes absolutely no sense at all, and creates havoc. So
I would say one thing that I was taught: if you start something with the wrong intentions, or if you start something with mixed or ulterior motives, you dampen it, and it'll eventually run into conflict to shake that out. And unfortunately, much of the church started with, as you said, these wrong intentions, wrong motivations. And all throughout history, I think it's very safe to say that Christianity has actually been worse on the Jewish people than Islam.
Yes.
And a lot of that has to do with the undercurrent and just the spread of Christianity across the world, to the point where it's just baked into the theology, even though it's not quite as, I would say, violent. It has many, many centuries of violence, and a lot of it comes from this time period. And I think that's why this time period is often neglected in church history lessons.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to add to that for people out there listening, I hate if this idea or thought that we're sitting here bashing the people that sit in the chairs and the pews of the church. That's not what we're doing, because most of them are not up to speed knowledge wise of the history, and knowledge wise of what again, it goes back to when you call Jesus Jewish, and if you call him Jewish and then you stop at just the name, you're calling him Jewish, but then you don't equate him to what that means, what that participation is, what his observance are, and things like this. It's taking it's taking a lot of who he is away from him. And so when we talk about this, it is, again, we're talking about a theology that was built on a certain lens and a certain viewpoint and a certain, idea to progress or to progress a certain idea, as opposed, and once it's gotten to the church today, I would say 90% of the people that sit in church chairs or whatever they're sitting in have no concept of this. They just they're being guided in a certain way to look at certain points that are being presented that day, but have no concept of what damaging or what damages the church has done through some of the church fathers and that, as we've led up to this point in time, to being anti-Semitic and what that means to our relationship with the Jewish people. And so it's just really it's overwhelming to think about sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really good point to make a distinction there, because we're going into history, right? The average person who's trying to make their ends meet and pay their bills and just be a good person, they're not thinking about the history here. We don't. When you hear this, just understand we're looking at the history. This has a lot to do with why the Jewish people have little interest in Christianity. This is why the message is not enticing, because for so many years it has it's been a very violent interaction.
Yeah, very well put.
Yeah, and so here let's get into the history of when things start to go actively at high levels against the Jewish people, and then we'll really start to see things make sense, right? So again, I don't want to speak too much about what Ray will cover, but we'll look at Emperor Hadrian, right? So Emperor Hadrian is 117 to 138 CE, and this is the span of time that the Bar Kokhba revolt happens, which is 132 to 135. So this happens under Hadrian's watch, and it was a very unfortunate time because Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem were destroyed in 70, and the Jewish people kind of trudged along in Israel alongside the Romans at this time. But the Bar Kokhba revolt, they really took the matters into their hands and they went after the Romans, and they had some success, but eventually this would be crushed, and the aftermath is catastrophic. The Jewish people who lived in Jerusalem and around the area, who were disciples and followers of Yeshua, they largely lived among the Jewish people at this time. There really wasn't a lot of animosity. And we even see up into the 7th century in parts of the Galilee, they lived together in synagogues. But the Bar Kokhba revolt really polarized everyone, because some people thought he was the Messiah. Rabbi Akiva even thought he was the Messiah, and was, he erred in this. It turned really sour, but it was not before people were made to choose: fight under this person, who some people believe is a Messiah, or flee and save yourself. And the believers of Yeshua, as Messiah, son of Joseph, they couldn't fight under Bar Kokhba. He clearly to them was not a Messiah. He was not a Messiah figure. He was actually about to cause destruction on what was left of the Jewish people. And it came to pass that the Messianic, we'll call them Messianic Jews, I don't really like using that term, but the Messianic Jews fled, and it really caused division among the Jews in Israel. And Hadrian, he smashed the rebellion, just killed so many Jewish people, innocent people who rebelled. It was just awful. Jews were banned from Jerusalem. No longer could they even set foot in Jerusalem. And this would be the case for centuries and centuries. The Romans actually renamed Israel Palestine, which is the word Philistine. So when you hear Palestine today, understand that was given by the Romans as an insult to the Jewish people who they had just taken over the city. They took Jerusalem, they named it Aelia Capitolina, and they basically renamed it and tried to eradicate Jewish people in Jerusalem. They made all the following illegal: Sabbath observance, Torah study, circumcision. This is all the same stuff that we saw.
Crazy. That's
right?
crazy.
We saw this in the time of Hanukkah. Like we saw this with the Maccabean revolt.
Yes.
But now it's coming a lot heavier down on the Jewish people. So believe it or not, up until this point, all of the leaders of this emerging movement were all Jews. The first 15 that they're called bishops were all Jews, up until the point of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And then after this, Hadrian would put a stop to that. And then we wouldn't see Jews again as leaders of this movement from this time forward.
Mhm.
So this is the soil. There are no Jews around anymore in much of the Roman Empire in different places. They're being kicked out, they're marginalized, the leaders are gone, right? So now we're starting to see, and what scholars are recognizing as true, which has not been what the traditional teachings have taught. You would get the impression from church historians, church fathers like Eusebius and Irenaeus, that one source of truth emerged from Israel under the teachings of the apostles, and then heresy everywhere, right? It's
Mhm.
actually the opposite that scholars are seeing today. There was a lot of diversity, and all of these different streams, like Gnosticism was not like, it wasn't like, hey, I'm a Gnostic, what are you, right?
Right.
Gnosticism is sort of a label of, it's like a catch-all of all these mixed theological outlooks that people are trying to make sense of today. It wasn't as if it was so clear cut.
Mm.
And what we're seeing, though, is a reversal. It did not start as one single source of truth, right? We see that. There are many Jewish theologies represented in the New Testament. What we're seeing is a lot of diversity, and even more diversity when the Gentiles are left alone without their Jewish leadership to explain these very difficult passages in the Torah. And, in the following centuries, this emerging, what we'll now call a church, is fragmenting. It's into various levels of chaos depending on where you are. People not familiar with deepest levels of Jewish thought are now coming to their own conclusions. It's mixing with Greek theology. It's mixing with other religions. It takes a series of church councils to really bring structure and unity at the cost of biblical truth, unfortunately. And these councils, as we'll talk about in a minute here, these councils really set the foundation that the church largely still follows today. And the sad thing is, you could be like someone like Polycarp, who was a student of John, and he was a Jew. Polycarp was Jewish, and he was martyred. And he really tried to fight to keep Sabbath observance in the way he was taught by his Jewish teacher, who was
Wow.
taught by Yeshua. And
Yes.
he eventually was martyred, but you would see that he was one of the last true fighters for keeping the Jewish route. And
Mm.
by the time, as we'll talk about later, you'll see people like Marcion come on board, and he'll coin the term Old Testament. And
Yes.
now there's a distinction between the New Testament and the Old Testament. And he recognized, at least in his worldview, that the God of the New Testament is higher than the Jews' God. And even went as far as to say Paul was the only true apostle of Yeshua.
Yes.
So, we start to see this chaos just erupt. And unfortunately, there were two massive moves that the church is still under today that have really damaged what would you say, the continuity of the apostles' teaching and
Mm.
Yeshua's teaching. And I'll just cover those. And then again, I want to get your thoughts because I know you've lived in this world too. So the first one is the Council of Nicaea.
Mm.
Among many of the topics covered at the Council of Nicaea in 325, we see the conversation of the quarter-decimans, right? The people who kept the 14th of Nisan, and we're about to celebrate Passover in a couple of days here. These are the quarter-deciman. These are the people who are keeping the 14th of Nisan as the Passover date, and they're celebrating it the way it's celebrated in the New Testament. And these people are basically known as like those who keep the 14th, right? They're keeping the 14th of Nisan on the Jewish calendar. And they're finding themselves to be at odds with this emerging and rapidly de-Judaizing movement, as Constantine is now a part of this picture. And it's decreed by Constantine. He says, talking about Passover and the need to switch to something else. And they call it this Easter, still
Mm.
celebrated today. Constantine says, and he doesn't like these separatists, right? He calls them separatists to a degree. These people are not getting on board. He says, it was decreed unworthy to observe that most sacred festival in accordance with the practice of the Jews. Having sullied their own hands with a heinous crime, such bloodstained men are, as one might expect, mentally blind. Let there be nothing in common between you and the detestable mob of Jews. We have received from the Savior another way, a course open to our most holy religion that is both lawful and proper. And he continues to rail on the Jews, but what he
Right.
does at the end of this council is he basically brings Easter, and I get the impression he didn't get a debriefing on what Easter was and where it came from and what its attachments were, but he basically swaps Easter on the Roman calendar from this Jewish calendar of Nisan 14, which, you know, the Jewish calendar is different than the solar calendar of the Romans. So it would be different times each year. And that was also a problem. They wanted to fix it so it didn't bump into other Roman holidays at the time. Now they're not celebrating the Passover the way it was taught, the way Paul instructs people to do. Paul tells people to keep this festival, right? And he did himself. But now they've replaced it with Easter, and we see still today we're seeing signs for Easter. So this was a very powerful move, and it was a big one that really severed the Gentile movement from its Jewish roots. And the next big one, and it's the popular one as well, we covered this from one perspective. This is the Council of Laodicea in 364, when the Church of Rome moved worship to Sunday instead of Saturday. And this was a huge deal because it separated Jewish and Gentile people who, if they even were still meeting at this time in this context, now they don't meet on the same day because the Jewish people are not going to meet on a Sunday. Sabbath is on the Saturday, right? This would be a problem. And the view of Saturday worship by Romans became scoffed at and abandoned. They looked at it as blind servitude. They saw it as a negative thing, something of the past. It's antiquated. And it's under Pope Sylvester, 314 to 335. He creates a day of fasting and mourning on Saturday. He basically commands that people fast and mourn on Saturday to distance the remaining Sabbath keepers, if you will, to distance them from celebrating the Sabbath with the Jewish people. And ideally, you know, they'd be so hungry and starving by the time Sunday came that they would celebrate and it would be a big fun day. But the big problem with Sunday is that the Sol Invictus cults of Roman society were very influential. And prior to this time, Constantine would help the calendar change from an 8-day Roman calendar to a 7. But at this time, Sunday was the day, the venerable day of the sun. And this Sol Invictus, this invincible sun cult, was very powerful. And Sunday people were already worshiping on Sunday. It was already the chief astrological being of the week. It was the first day of the week, right? And when this calendar changes, we would see people adopt Sunday because that's just what they were already doing. And they didn't really see a big problem with that. And you'll even see early Christian art connects Jesus with the sun. You'll see the sun imagery connected with Jesus. And this is a very deep topic, very painful for some people to talk about. But effectively, at this time, you know, Sunday became for Gentiles by law. And you would even see the preeminent authority in Rome was given to the bishop. And the bishop was allowed now to make new religious observances for all people within the empire. And from this point forward, honestly, you really see the church is mired into East and West issues. They're no longer asking the Jewish question. They're no longer concerned if they're doing it right the way the Jewish people did it, right? That's no longer even a question anymore. That's such a thing of the past. Now it's all about how the Eastern church is doing it versus the Western. And again, a lot of this starts from the Western church. The Eastern church still maintains a lot of observances very similar to the Didache, and it's actually impressive to see. But a lot of and this is the thing that kind of gets me the most, a lot of Protestant theology comes from the Roman Catholic Church, mostly because Roman Catholicism was Martin Luther's upbringing, and he didn't want to leave the Roman Catholic Church. He was a Catholic monk in theology, but what people are usually unaware of is that their theology came from its own tree. It wasn't even another branch of the Jewish tree. It was its own concoction, mix of different Roman beliefs. I hate to say it, but pagan pagan influence, Greek Hellenistic influence, and as we said earlier, a lot of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish thought.
Wow, you covered a lot there, brother. And I you can't one of the hardest ways to attack, I think, the Jewish culture was number one to hit the calendar,
Yep.
was to hit the original calendar,
Yep.
day wise, but also the weekly calendar. You have the calendar of festivals and feasts and so forth, holidays and so forth. But then you have the weekly calendar, and the weekly calendar was in place for a reason. And if you're going to, I'm not going to, there's so many different words you could use, but if you're going to really hit them in the gut, so to speak, then to keep that separatism going, what better way to do it than to move the day from the Sabbath to a Sunday, and then say, okay, the Sunday gatherings are now going to be more important than those on that observe the Sabbath. And so you're basically just slapping them back in the face, um, outside of messing with the yearly calendar, because calendars were important in not just the cycle of the year, but those were important moments to grow the faith, for repentance, for different aspects of the faith. But then when you got into the weekly calendar, you were building up to that Sabbath, okay, and all of a sudden now you're going to say, I'm just going to hit you upside the head, and we're going to move this thing over to Sunday, and we're going to take this group of people who are now from a replacement theological standpoint, put them in place as this is the day that they don't have to worry about this over here. They can do their own thing here. And so it was a very, as somebody who came up not as knowledgeable of the early church, or the early gatherings, but just of the separation, and for that separation to look a certain way as a church attendee, and then studying it a little bit within. It's funny when you bring up words like seminary or Bible study or Bible church or Bible colleges and things like that. Um, people will become enamored if you have a degree from an institution like that,
Yeah.
but they don't understand that institution is developed under guidelines and
Yeah.
principles and things of certain creeds and dogmas that represent that denomination.
That's a great point.
And it can be as off kilter as what someone might say from a platform, just not even thinking about it. So getting back into you know thinking about the creeds themselves, and thinking about just for me, the more and more I get deeper into this study and understanding the cycle of the week, the cycle of the year, what that does to your personal growth, but also what that does to your growth with other people as well. It's extremely damaging the way you look at how it progressed, and it continues to separate. The separatism there from this gathering over here is saying to the mother faith, this is done. We got a better idea. It's 11 o'clock on Sunday, and Saturday you hit Home Depot, instead of understanding the purpose of those cycles and the purpose
Yeah.
of those dates and so forth. So it took me a little while to grasp not just the yearly calendar, but also the weekly calendar, and the importance of that, and the importance of building up to the Sabbath and what the Sabbath represents, because people will call Sunday the Sabbath, but it has no correlation whatsoever with what the true Sabbath is and what the true Sabbath means to an individual within their faith. Um, within this, the historical faith.
Yeah.
So it just it's a constant awakening and a constant awareness of why these things were why God put into place the yearly calendar, why we have the weekly calendar, and these were all strategic pieces to maintain a forward movement with our faith, our belief, the way we care for ourselves, and so forth like that. And you can't cram that into a 35-minute message at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings and
Yeah.
just say, I'm good. Here's my check. I'll check in with you next week. You know.
Yeah, and I think the collateral damage to that, what do you want to call that? The funnel, of less time, less dedication, less understanding, all of that funnels down
Yes.
to a lot less spiritual growth. That's why I think it's one of the saddest things you'll see, that people will be on fire
Yes.
for a little bit and then it fades. It gets
Yes.
washed away. And Yeshua has a parable about that, right? The parable of the sower. And he was talking to people who were observing the Torah, who were keeping the calendar, who were keeping the holidays. They were spiritually protective
Mhm.
of right their nefesh and the shama there in the ruach. They were being very careful with their soul, and they still could be one of those four categories in the parable of the sower. Three of the four don't make it, right? They don't make
Yes.
it very far. So, and
Yes.
that's for people who are doing it. So imagine if you are of a tradition that these things were banned or outlawed or dismissed or marginalized because of the people they were associated with. And that's exactly what we're seeing in
Yes.
the church. We're seeing
Yes.
a long tradition that
Yes.
really, as far as I'm concerned, in the West, is is coming out of the work of Domitian, the work of Hadrian, the work of
Mm.
Constantine, and many bishops along the way who mixed religion and state power,
Mm.
and we were more expedient politically than understanding the Torah or wanting to understand the Torah. And unfortunately, there are some very genuine people who want to know more, but they just don't have a place to go, as you said, because traditions in seminaries only go back so far, or they
Yes.
go back through one channel. So yeah, man, it really is. I think it's important that people spread this information when they can, but
Mm.
it's really hard to make sure that someone picks it up and follows it, because there aren't a lot of places to go today
Mm.
to start this. Okay, you learn the truth. Now what? Right? Where do
Mm.
people go?
Right. Right. And the gathering aspect of it, I think, is shifting as well, because we are in an environment that's adjusting to certain ways that we gather because of the pandemic, because of just certain things that have come up in society that you know I don't like if I say the word dumbing down of theology, it is yet it's so true. And the way you put it painted a really good picture for me. The
Mhm.
funneling of theology down to a point to where it really becomes two or three points. And with those two or three points, if you can get a motivational speaker up there that can do things like a Stephen Furtick or a Joel Olstein, who can who can push the emotional button. Um,
Yeah.
but that emotional button's only going to go so far. That emotional button's only going to create, a certain, element within your life, and not getting down into the nuts and bolts of what the faith is all about. And James, you did a fantastic job of just kind of going through this, because that was a lot of information on the historical piece of it and getting us up to this point. I believe we're at the point, correct, if that we'll have Ray take over next week and
Yeah.
bring us up currently into to what we see. And again, there are a lot of just incredibly wonderful people that attend church gatherings every week
Yeah.
across the world, and not just in our country, but across the world. But the theology itself, mixed in with anti-Semitism, mixed in with just lack of knowledge of who Jesus really is. who, what he represents through his, his own being, his own culture, so forth, his own context, miss out on a whole awful lot. So I'm gonna let you have the final couple words here, buddy, as we shut this session down. And like I said, you did a great job of just unwrapping this whole process up to this point. And we're gonna let Ray come in here next week and do his thing. But I'm gonna let you have the final few words here as we wrap this up, buddy.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. It's always good to have you back too. Driving the show here, keeping us on track. Yeah, but I'm really looking forward to seeing what Ray comes up with as well. I know he loves this era. I think it's an important era to study. For the people listening, I think it can be very difficult. It can be very challenging, and it creates a dissonance of, okay, what now, right? For people who get it and understand it, or maybe they came across this and they knew it was there and they just suppressed it. Well, now we've brought it out. What's next? And I do think that the apostles had no intention of ever creating anything other than a Jewish community that reintroduced Gentiles. And it's fascinating that 2 centuries later, the church would be asking, do we include Jews in this at all? So I think it's unfortunate that history went the way it did, but it did go that way. It's very difficult to get these communities back together. I would just tell everyone who's listening to have an open stance. When you come across Jewish people, ask questions, get their insights, ask what they do and how they do things. Maybe you can learn from them, and maybe they can learn from you. I've seen beautiful situations where people put down the guards. They're not speaking in polemics, and they're not trying to convert people, and they just have beautiful conversations, and they share wisdom and knowledge in life and perspectives on the Bible, or just perspectives in life. I would say just be a little more open-handed, and keep the conversation going on the Facebook page as well. If you have questions on what to do, you are curious about what to do next, let's keep the conversation going. Again, you can find us on Rethinking Faith podcast on Facebook. And yeah, thank you for your time, you, Mitch, as well, and thanks everyone listening for your time. We love the notes, we love the feedback. If there's something you want to hear us talk about, shoot us a message. We love to hear it.
Thank you, buddy. I appreciate that. And again, from my half of the contribution tonight, blessings to those of you that have listened to this, and to your family. Stay safe out there. And like I said, the second half of this episode will show up sometime next week when we get Ray in here. But from James and I both, I hope you stay safe, and we will catch you on the next Rethinking Faith podcast.